Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining today. I can see that there are several of you in the comments, and I'm just going to put a comment here. Yeah, I can see the video starting. Okay. I'm live now. Okay, so let's take a look at some of your comments here. And just also going to maybe check, make sure my audio is working. See this. Maybe the okay. And check over here. Okay, but if you can hear me fine, you can just maybe leave a little comment there. Just making sure everything's working. Okay, yeah, I can hear myself there. Okay, great. So let's go through some of the comments, and I just want to say hi to Sharif, Kimberly, Gosha, Leah, and also thank you, Leah, for this question that you had sent me about this topic. So let's get into a couple of the comments, and hello, Rena, as well. Okay, so first of all, I sent out the topic for today about learning multiple languages at the same time or simultaneously. And I also mentioned as a speaking topic for today the concept of laddering. And I'll mention a little bit about this for today. Okay, so let's look at one of the comments here. So Sarah says, I have a few questions about learning multiple languages at once that I only partly know. The answer's two. And maybe we could answer them in the chat while waiting. Okay. How much sense does it make to learn vocabulary for multiple languages at once? Okay, what are good methods to combine languages? Any advantages of learning multiple languages that we maybe didn't know? Okay. What do you have to keep in mind when starting new languages on top of the old ones you're already learning? What worked in the past? What didn't work? Do you know why? How do you manage your time? How to keep track? Do you have a language journal or something similar for every single language, or one for all of them? These are excellent questions. I think I'll probably have to keep reflecting on them a little bit more than just today. And Leah mentions, I believe learning two or more languages helps me in that they reinforce each other, but I believe the learning curve is slower than sticking with one. Okay, that is a valid point. How fast can you go if you are doing, if you're multitasking, basically? And yeah, hello, Sharif, how are you doing? And what else on here? Okay, just saying we're getting started. And any other questions? Okay, thank you for discussing that. I love the laddering concept. Okay, great. So let's get into a couple of these questions, and I'll kind of take these little by little. So first of all, is it possible to learn more than one language at the same time? Yes. Now there are, you'll find kind of both sides of the debate online. In my own experience, I started Spanish when I was in my first year of high school. I did that for 2 years. That was my only foreign language at the time. I did that for 2 years. I went from the beginner to the pre-intermediate level. Then when I was in my junior year of high school, then I started to learn French. And so in my third year at the high school, I was in Spanish 3 and French 1. Then my last year of high school, I was in Spanish 4 AP. That means it's an advanced placement course that could allow me to get college or university credit if I passed the test. And my French teachers, because they saw that I already spoke another Romance language, the Spanish had helped accelerate my French studies so that I could completely skip year 2. And my teachers put me into year 3 of French. It was actually my second year of French, but because of the Spanish that I had been learning from the past 3 years, and simultaneously that I was doing French 1, that helped me boost my French and move on to a higher level and completely skip year 2. So what I learned from that experience is that if you can do 2 languages, perhaps not from scratch, both of them at the same time, and if they're related, like our 2 Romance languages, that could be potentially confusing, especially if you're looking at like prepositions, prepositional use from one language to another. That could potentially drive you crazy. But if you go about this in a way that I had done, which was I had one language that was more advanced than the other one, that helped me accelerate the next one. And some people would say that that first foreign language that I learned, it was the experience of how to learn a foreign language. More than actually learning the foreign language itself, it was the how to learn process. So the question here from Sharif: Romance languages. This is Romance language does not mean like it's romantic, meaning love and stuff. It means it's come from derived from Latin. So Romance referring to Rome, referring to the languages that derive from Latin. So those are French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. And because they have that shared linguistic background, there is an overlap of grammatical concepts and similar vocabulary and roots. You can also compare this to the Slavic languages. For example, Russian, Czech, Polish, and I'm trying to blank on some of the other names. Those would have some overlap as well, some similarities in the roots, the vocabulary roots, and some grammatical structures. But the idea is if you learn it within a family, or let's say you take some of the Northern European languages like German, Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, those would have some kind of a shared history of that background. So some grammatical structures and some vocabulary will most likely be familiar. You don't exactly have to learn everything from scratch. I would compare this to say if you learn how to drive one car, in theory, you can drive another car. Even though it's built by a different car manufacturer, it might take you a little bit to test drive it. Like if you rent a car, you go to the airport in a new city and you rent a new car, there's a little bit of a kind of getting used to it. Like, oh, in this car, when you go to move the windows up and down, there's a button over here. In this car, the button's over there. Or maybe in this car, it's a manual. You have to move something to get the windows to go up and down. I would say in some languages, there is a little bit of that process where we express the present tense this way. We express the present tense that way. If you can find 2 languages that have a lot of these features in common, that's going to accelerate your learning. If for some reason things are completely different, that potentially can kind of drive you crazy a little bit at the beginning, while you'll have to deal with automated habits that you've formed. This applies again with the car. Like I switched from one car to another. I was used to the button for the window being on the door. And then it took me some time to get used to a new car where the button for the window was in the middle, where the radio was. So you don't quite realize that you build these habits by becoming familiar with a certain language, but they take over. The frontal cortex just, it doesn't want to have so much attention. Like I'd say like the short-term memory, it's very precious space. So as much of that can be put into an automated routine, that would be better. So a lot of the language learning process is at the initial stages is trying to get familiar with what are these concepts that I'm going to be using over and over again, and try to get them automated. Now, when you go to learn a second language at the same time, if you're still in that process of trying to learn a new paradigm, if I could say it that way, it might still be too fresh and not yet a habit if you're constantly switching back and forth to another language, if that first one is not yet formed. This is a little bit with the multitasking, where like if I'm trying to build a course and write a book and teach and take care of my family, like something is going to be less than good quality, because I'm splitting my attention among 3 or 4 activities, in this case like 2 languages. So if they're both from scratch, I might not necessarily learn both of them as effectively if I could focus on one of them for a limited amount of time, and then maybe pick up a little bit on the another one. That is a recommendation that a lot of people hear in the Add One challenge, where they just want people to focus on one language for 3 months. And then after those 3 months are up, they can go ahead and switch to another language to kind of boost that language for 3 months. I did participate for Russian, and I was tempted to start learning Greek from scratch. And so I had 1 month overlap before the 3 months were up. So I had done 2 months of Russian intensively. And then that last month, it was a bit hard to continue with my Russian, finish that for the last month of the 90 days, and try to start Greek from scratch. And then I went on vacation, and my whole routine kind of crashed. And I would say this was 3 years ago, in about July or so. And then that took me a long time to kind of just get back into the language learning, build my confidence up again on my routine. But luckily that led to starting the 30-day speaking challenge, because I wanted to just get back into speaking, and not necessarily committing to the 90-day process. But the idea there was do one language, focus on that for 3 months or a limited amount of time, then move on to another one. That would be like if you had one language that was much more advanced than another one, that can help accelerate. But if they're from scratch, I think you might want to give yourself a moment to focus on that one language to get the basics in place. Now, the speaking challenge, like I have been able to do multiple languages here. I have been able to do, I was able to do 6 languages, kind of 5-6 languages for 6 months. But then things have been kind of getting crazy with my schedule lately. But the idea there, I mean, the quality of my recordings was not necessarily all that great, but I was able to switch. And that's kind of code switching, is where you go from one language to the other. Some people struggle with code switching where they might not have the languages completely compartmentalized, that they're separate. I've, over the years, because the languages have been kind of layered, that I did Spanish, then I did French, then after 2 years of French, then I started with German. And then after German was like a year or two, then I did a little bit of Italian. So each one of these languages had some kind of a growth period where I could kind of focus on this, put another one on the back burner, kind of put that into a kind of autopilot, or keep growing in it, but kind of autopilot, and then shift my focus to something new, focus on that a little bit, and have the other things kind of going, kind of like juggling a little bit. So I wasn't studying everything from scratch at the same time. There was, like, my Spanish was the most advanced. Then after that, French, and then French was starting to get a little bit outpacing my accelerating past my Spanish, because I could kind of, if you've ever taken a basketball and then you take a golf ball and you put the golf ball on top of a basketball and you drop the two, the golf ball, it's going to rocket towards the ceiling, because there is this exponential kind of, you get this combined effect where, so it just felt like my French was that golf ball sitting next to the basketball, and it just went boom. So my French really started to accelerate. And then German seemed to have a few things that were familiar between learning foreign languages and between English and French. And I was able to accelerate as well a little bit in my German. So things seemed to just accelerate the more I got exposed to. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case for everybody out there. I just seemed to have an analytical mind, to kind of spot familiar patterns, similarities, things that were common, vocabulary in common. And I think sometimes I might be a little bit lazy in terms of not necessarily wanting to learn lots and lots of new vocabulary. I kind of wanted to streamline, like, if this international word exists in 3 or 4 languages, I would prefer that word, as opposed to 4 separate words in 4 languages. That just would mean I'd have to remember this one and that one. So an example would be like the word important. Like, that might be similar in English and Spanish and French, but it's different in German. And then I always struggle to remember that word in German, because it's different from these other 3. And I'm a little lazy in that respect. But maybe the word president, that exists in these 4 languages. So there I don't have to kind of put like a little bookmark or something on that one word that's different in one language. So if I can find international words that are similar within the languages that I'm learning, that just makes it a little bit easier for me. So that's a little bit of this laddering where I could boost or accelerate the studies. Now, more specifically in this laddering, it would be like in my bookshelf, I have dictionaries for French and German, or I have a dictionary for Spanish and French. Or recently I have a dictionary for Spanish and Russian. Now, probably the question is like, why don't I have those in English? And it's just that sometimes I'm not thinking in English. Sometimes sometimes a concept might be easier to translate from one language to another language, because it might just be one word, whereas in English it might be 3 or 4 words. And looking in the dictionary, I might not find that one word as quickly as if I just did it from Spanish to French, because those 2 languages might be related. I have also language books and guides. For example, I was given as a gift a Russian course written in French. So I would read these little short stories, and then I could look at them side by side, kind of bilingual. When I went to France at Christmas, I bought some short stories that were, the original was Russian, and then because I was in France, they were also bilingual for French. So that is an example of like laddering, where I could use what I'm familiar with in one language that can kind of help me with the language maintenance of that language. I just want it to keep going in autopilot, and maybe I want to accelerate a little bit in this other language. Let me get back into the questions here. I've been talking a while. So Sharif is asking, how far did I get in Arabic? Not far. I always was struggling with the script, and that took a while. And then I got a bit lazy using kind of Google Translate for getting a few phrases that I wanted to try to say. And then I was always struggling with the pronunciation, and I was told that the pronunciation kind of changed from one country to another. So that that felt like it slowed me down a little bit, because I was, even though I was trying to absorb kind of modern standard Arabic, I didn't have enough resources at my disposal for the sound of the language, and just kind of absorb that and try to use that. So I need to rethink the Arabic, because right now I really, after 6 months of like trying to use it and then 6 months of not using it, there's very little that's remained. And which languages am I thinking in now? Well, most of my day it's spent teaching English, so English is definitely the language that I'm using predominantly. But I'm trying to get back into thinking and speaking a lot more on the other ones. Let me get back to the other questions here. So how much sense does it make to learn vocabulary for multiple languages at once? I think that can be helpful if you're taking a language family. So if you had the Romance languages and you had like a Romance language dictionary of words that were in common, these things like important, president, door, those kinds of words that might be similar across those languages, that could help you kind of not necessarily start from scratch, but you could kind of start at kind of false beginner with a couple of those languages. Good methods to combine these languages. I mentioned a little bit with like the short stories, where they might be side-by-side bilingual. One technique that I used with TV show scripts was I took the Friends TV show, because at the time I had purchased all the DVDs and I was familiar with all the stories and all the characters. And online, I was able to find the subtitles as a text document, and I just downloaded those and put them side by side in an Excel, like in the spreadsheet tool. And I had these subtitles, the same phrase translated into Czech, Hungarian, and Polish, because I gave myself 6 months to work on Czech, Polish, and Hungarian for a trip to Central Europe. That was when I was living in Europe, and I had on my cell phone, I was listening to audio files that I made a playlist to put on my phone, and I had about a 45-minute commute to the office when I was teaching at offices, and I had also that about 45-hour to go home in the evening. So that gave me at least about an hour and a half to 2 hours to listen to audio material in basic Czech, basic Polish, basic Hungarian. And at that point, this was 11 years ago, I had already been learning foreign languages and teaching them for about 13 years at the time. So being able to know what worked for me and how I could accelerate this and learn 2 or 3 things at the same time, I was able to hack some of that and realize that I was a visual learner, and I could want to associate the sound with the writing. That helped. So I had the audio files to listen to with material, and I could look at a PDF on my phone or some text, and then I had some of the subtitles that were in a document, and I could scroll through those and see them kind of simultaneously translated in 3 or 4 languages. So I was able to do that for about like 2 hours a day and do 3 languages for 6 months, but really at a basic level, just so I could order some food, ask for some directions, or say hello and goodbye in a store, those kinds of things. Say advantages of learning multiple languages. Well, it opens doors to being able to just interact with lots of people. My first trip to Europe, it was just this incredible experience. Just the flight itself, to go to Europe from LA. I was on a 12-hour flight with my friends who were studying French, and on the plane they were Europeans going back to Europe. So I was sitting next to a German girl and her father, and they were generous to let me practice a little German with them. I don't know, for some reason on the way to walking in the plane, I met a woman from Spain, and she was generous enough to let me practice a little bit of Spanish. So I was just really excited to be in that kind of an environment where I could turn around, practice one language, turn around, practice another. So I'm comfortable with code switching and meeting people and doing that. I do recognize that there are times when family, relatives have visited, let's say when I was in France and family from Mexico visited France, that code switching back and forth with Spanish and French over a period of like 24 hours, it was a bit tiring, a bit exhausting. And then on top of that, when I had family here in Mexico visiting from France and from the United States, that was even more challenging. I remember one anecdote where my wife's grandfather, he's from France, her uncle from Mexico, and my father wanted to talk to each other, but each one of them wasn't comfortable speaking the other languages. So the French grandfather would say something in French. I would translate that immediately into Spanish and English. The Mexican uncle might say something in Spanish to respond or comment. I would translate that into French and English. Then my dad would say something in English, and then I translate that back into French and Spanish. I didn't even really participate in the conversation. It was just kind of translating everything that everybody was saying into two other languages, or 2 or 3 other languages. And then a couple of days later, my dad made some comment like, "Oh, I had this really interesting conversation. I don't remember. Were you there?" So you could work as an interpreter, you could work as a translator, but sometimes people who are working in spontaneous interpretation, they have to do it for like 30 minutes and then stop, because it just you cease to exist. You just you're just there to input, output. And I think there was one meal where my parents were visiting, and my mother-in-law, who's Mexican, she had said something in English, but because I was so used to just translating, I took what she said in English, said it again to my parents in English, and everybody looked at me of like, "What did you just do?" It was just an input output. I didn't even realize what language the input was. I just went into kind of an automated mode. So it is possible to kind of find jobs and work that could be related to the languages, interpreting, translating, proofreading, teaching. There are more opportunities in business. There might be open markets, more people to interact with. Let's say, like, what do you have to keep in mind when starting a new language on top of the other ones? Well, a little bit of understanding what is your learning style. Like, are you visual? Are you good at hearing something? Do you need to see it written while you hear it? Do you need to be hands-on? You need to use it. Kind of keep in mind what has worked for you in the past and what has not worked for you, and try to do more of what's worked and try to do less of what hasn't worked. And if something hasn't worked, try to understand why didn't it work, and then try to find materials that would be more aligned with what has worked for you. And now with the internet, there are many ways to get creative with the materials that you could use. You could ask somebody to make a recording for you. You could ask somebody to proofread something that you've written. In the speaking challenge, we're commenting on things that we say. And we could also ask some people to record corrections or take what we've said, write it down, transcribe it, and then read it out for us. That is something that I have done for my students for the TOEFL who are working on the speaking. I might write down what they said and then comment on what their mistakes were. I could also record it with better intonation, or so there are other ways you can build on what you've already done for your learning, and to help you accelerate that. And keeping track, I think it is helpful to have a some kind of a notebook, because if you're just basing everything off of your memory, it might fade, especially if it's multiple languages. I noticed that, especially conversations like with my family or my wife, my kids, I might not always remember what the language was that we were speaking at the time. I end up remembering the content. So if you're learning multiple languages and you have vocabulary words, it is possible that you might forget, like, did I learn that new word in French or did I learn that in Spanish? If you end up just remembering the concept itself. So it would be helpful to have, like, keeping track of which language this is. When I'm getting exposed to like the 2-3 languages, I do like to have separate files. So if I said like Spanish and French and English, I might like to look at it from Spanish and French together, Spanish and English, and French and English, and see, like, are there similarities or are there differences? If that could be the grammar, the vocabulary, and looking at it from those different angles might activate the grammar, the vocabulary in a few different ways, instead of just everything based off of English to Spanish, English to French. That's a bit like a train network where everything is centralized. It might not always be the most effective. Like, I'm thinking of like train network in France, like everything has to go to Paris. For me, that's like the languages, and thinking like everything does everything have to go back to English? And I'd say no, it doesn't. It would be a much more robust network if I could say Spanish can go to French, French can go to Spanish, or French can go to German, and have those little hubs that are not necessarily dependent all the time on English. So I do recognize also that in the language learning, there's a bit of an onion effect. So when I got into German, if I didn't know a word, I probably went back to French, and then if I couldn't think of something in French, I'd go to Spanish, and finally, if I couldn't think of it in Spanish, I'd go to English. So each thing that I had learned, it was like in a layer. And I would say sometimes my Russian is on top of German and a little bit of Italian. So I might go back through like German, French, Spanish before I get to English, in terms of trying to find vocabulary words or grammatical structures. So you don't always have to be dependent on your native language. If you can get these 2 or 3 other languages to be related and strengthened, you'll have a very robust mental network. And that requires you to think and write and listen in the passive active, in all these different senses. So for example, if you listen to something in French and maybe write it down in English, or you listen in English and try to write it down in French, or you listen in Spanish and try to say it in German, try to combine a couple of these senses of reading, writing, listening, speaking, and from one language to another, or within the same language if you're dictating and hearing it, writing it down. Try to activate all of those little connections as much as you can, and that will get strengthened. A lot of people, they think they have to kind of separate completely like oh, I keep messing up Spanish and Italian, I sometimes say embrace that. So learn Spanish and Italian kind of together, and that frequency, you'll start to see this one is this one's that, as opposed to trying to kind of isolate them. For example, with my kids, like they start to fight and I tell them, hey, no, separate rooms. I don't want the two of you talking to each other or fighting. And sometimes that's not the best solution. Sometimes we need to say, okay, let's work out our disagreements. Let's see if we can be friendly and play together and coexist without killing each other. Let's see if we can like be together without always getting angry. That would be a much better process, at least for the kind of raising kids. For the languages, I think it is possible to have the languages coexist in your head without necessarily going crazy. And a few other comments here. And I say, like, haven't been learning the academic way. At the beginning, there was academic. I mean, there was, because I was at school for high school and college. So we did have a textbook and a audio cassette, CD. Probably not, the YouTube didn't exist at the time. Facebook didn't exist at the time. I'm really old. So there were a lot less options there for kind of, if I was using the internet, it was really to just send messages on ICQ. And there wasn't even audio or video exchange. It was just text. So it was a bit limited about 19 years ago when I was doing a lot of this stuff. Is it something in our DNA that drives us into learning languages? I mean, everybody around the world is engineered for learning language. Everybody has a native language. And I'm not necessarily if it's a specific personality, but everybody has the capability to learn a language. Sometimes we don't quite realize how we learn a language, but everybody is capable of that. And have I presented at the Langfest yet? So, oh, no, not yet. That'll be in August. And my priority right now in June, July is finishing my presentation to get that ready. And Sarah, Sharif, growing up in a bilingual environment must have helped acquiring and struggle against a one perspective. I think with the surviving or the surroundings, you kind of need to make your own language environment or kind of a bubble or something immersive that is encouraging you to want to learn. So that could be a room in your home that's dedicated to languages, or a desk where you have your books and CDs or audio files, or your notebooks. And what are your tools, tricks for compartmentalizing? I guess some of that could be having like a language app that's only in one language, not mixed. And I find I cross-pollute one language with another when I really get speaking. That part, yeah, the speaking part, you have to activate it. So you might want to have language partners who don't speak a foreign language. By that, I mean have, like, if you have a partner for French and you know that they speak your native language, or you know that they speak this other language, there's a tendency that you might cheat or you might overlap. That happens in my family environment with French and Spanish and English. We might cross back and forth between French and Spanish if we forget a word. But when I'm talking to my wife's family who speak Spanish, I know that they don't speak French, so I need to make sure that my Spanish is more pure and doesn't have some kind of a little crossover from French. Okay. So yeah, finding people who are a bit more monolingual, that's a good way to force you to compartmentalize. I did the car travel thing for French and Greek. I'm planning for a trip. I call it traveler's language. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And some new and advanced vocab. Wow, I love this kind of international conversation and the learning styles. I work for a company. Leia says, I work for a company growing through programs in a target language before publishing. And it was great fun and really helped my German, French, and Italian. Oh, I think I understand. Like the support language, like the menus and the documentation may have been in one or the other. Closemaster is a fun app. And yeah, good. Okay. And let's see if I can hold on to these comments, because these are excellent questions. I'd love to spend more time and actually like maybe write down a few more things. Okay. And okay. Great. Okay. And what language am I speaking usually with my wife? Nowadays, it's more English, because I just teach English all day long. So it's a little faster for me to stay in English. But then I do go back and forth with French and Spanish with her. Unfortunately, my Spanish, bizarrely, or not bizarrely, but it has been decreasing, that I've been speaking English constantly on a daily basis. And sometimes I'm not going outside. So even just to go buy some tortillas at the tiendita, the little store, or go to the supermarket. Now I'm going to the market more frequently to buy fruit and vegetable, and it's forcing me to interact with more people. So I actually need to practice my Spanish, even though I've been living in Mexico for almost 11 years. It's kind of crazy, but it's possible to be absorbed in one language, my native language, through teaching, and then neglect a little bit that practice part. And then when I do come across people, they tell me, oh, well, I can see that you're struggling in Spanish, just say it in English. And that just frustrates me a little bit even more, because I want to practice the Spanish, but they know that I teach English, or they know that I speak English. So they're trying to make it easier on me to just continue speaking in English, but I really need to find a practice partner. So going back to about this question about compartmentalizing, I would say sometimes with the maid, who I know doesn't speak English, there I have an opportunity to only speak Spanish because she doesn't speak English, and she's not going to ask me like, oh, well, just say it in English. There isn't that option. It's kind of like burning the boats. So that's a good thing, is find people who are monolingual and there's no temptation to switch. That will force you to kind of stay a bit more pure with that one language. I remember when I was in Europe, and the first time when I visited, the host family, they spoke English, and the girl who was my age, she also spoke English, and my French was just a little lower. It was because it was only 2 years, and she was telling me like, "Oh, you look like you're struggling. Just say it in English." And again, that frustrated me back 20 years ago. But her little brothers, who were like 8 or 9 or 10 years old, they hadn't learned English yet in school. So all they spoke was French. And I loved playing with them, like playing soccer, or playing their video games with them, because there was no temptation of them telling me like, oh, you're struggling in French, just say it in English. They didn't speak English. So French was the language of communication. And I loved that. That's where I thrived a little bit more, is not having that temptation to switch, or being told, give up. I hate I hate that recommendation of, oh, just give up, do what's easier. I like to persist, or push through that difficulty. So that for sometimes with my wife, for a long time, I wanted to only speak in French or Spanish with her. And that created a few communication problems at times, where I was struggling, but I wanted to keep pushing through. And at some point we did just start to switch to English, and then things have been a lot faster, especially now with kids, because the kids interrupt us every 2 seconds. So if I'm having a hard time finishing my sentence in Spanish or French, it just comes out a little faster if I just keep it in English. And I also want to encourage my kids to speak English. So it's fine if at home I'm speaking English all day long, and I want the kids to learn English because I'm the only person they're speaking English with. Unfortunately, I need to wrap up, but I love these topics. I love this thing about the language learning and these questions. And I think we will take a couple of these questions to continue for throughout the challenge, and also moving a couple of these questions over into the Facebook group as well. Maybe in the next coaching call, speak the target languages. Okay, that could be interesting. Yeah, we could invite a couple of people to join and get me to practice. That's a great idea. Okay, so thank you Thank you so much, all of you, for joining. I see there's about a dozen of us still here, but now my next student is waiting and saying she wants to start. Okay. Oh, and this last question. Yeah, my wife speaks Spanish and French to the kids. And actually, sometimes she speaks a little bit of English to them. They're a little bit more receptive sometimes. Sometimes they don't want to speak English with me, but they'll speak English with her. So whatever works, whatever gets the kids to practice. So thank you, Irina. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Sharif, and Gosia and Kimberly for joining here today, and Irina, if I had mentioned you. And so yeah, all great questions, and I love these little weekly chats. So keep up your great work and have a great week, and we'll be in touch in the challenge. Take care. Bye.